Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome to the 25th anniversary celebration of Stanford's Southeast Asia program. Welcome to this beautiful space. This is really fantastic. And to this panel, the Anthropocene in Southeast Asia, Two Rivers. As Dawn mentioned, I'm Rebecca Day-Romanarchek. I am a faculty member in Integrated Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. I'm an environmental sociologist, and I focus primarily on food systems in Southeast Asia. And we're going to have two speakers here today on this panel. And our first speaker, who does not need much of an introduction, will be Dr. James Scott, who is the Sterling Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Yale University. He's the author of 6 highly influential books in Southeast Asian studies, including Weapons of the Weak and Seen Like a State. His work is focused primarily on agrarian studies and the resistance of subaltern populations to powerful actors. And I have, you all are some of the first to know, but actually Dr. Scott's latest book, In Praise of Floods, The Stake of All Creatures in the Freedom of Rivers, will be coming out late this summer or early fall of 2024. Our second speaker will be Mr. Brian Eiler, who is a senior fellow and director of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program and the Energy, Water, and Sustainability program. He is the winner of the 2021 ESRI Special Achievement in GIS Award, which I think you'll really see why in his presentation today, some really phenomenal maps that you'll be seeing. He's a leading voice in Southeast Asian studies on environmental, energy, and water security issues in the Mekong, and his first book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, was published in 2019. Before we start with the panel, I want to briefly introduce the idea of this panel, set the scene, and our focus for concentrating on hydrological systems in this panel. And I have some really bad news for you, but apparently the Anthropocene does not exist. So in the February of this year, the International Union of Geological Sciences voted to decline creating a new geological time period called the Anthropocene, which is startling to some, but others not. But I think really what we on this panel are interested in, and environmental scientists in general are interested in, is not the label on the bottle, but the contents of the bottle. And really what that is the human impacts on our environment. Whether it constitutes a separate geological era or not, environmental scientists are interested in studying these human impacts. You can call it whatever you like. In Southeast Asian studies, we've called it the Plantationocene, we've called it the Anthropocene, we've called it the Capitalocene, we've even called it the Catastrophozoic. That one's a new one to me. But what we're discussing today, as Dipesh Chakrabarty defines it, is a time in which humans have become geological agents, changing the most basic physical processes of the Earth. And specifically in this panel, our speakers will be focusing on the ways that human actors have influenced the established cycles, flows, and patterns of hydrological systems, and the impact that is having on the communities that live near and rely on the Mekong and Irrawaddy river systems in Southeast Asia. And that's both human and non-human. Both of our speakers will be discussing rivers and freshwater systems in mainland Southeast Asia, but that doesn't actually exclude the island nations of the region nor the maritime systems there, because all of these systems are inextricably linked through their political ties, but also in that changes in one inevitably lead to the changes in the other. Our world functions as a holistic entity, whether humans recognize or acknowledge that or not. And I think both speakers focusing on the established cycles and disruptions to these cycles really highlights that reality. Please welcome me in joining our speakers, Dr. James Scott and Mr. Brian Eiler. And Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by saluting Donald Emerson, who is a colleague and a close friend for many, many decades. I have the a great deal of respect for what he has accomplished, both institutionally at Stanford and his own scholarship on Indonesia and on Southeast Asia in general and the South China Sea. So I'm honored to be a part of this celebration. I also, because I'm not going to talk about it centrally, um, uh, you should know that those of us who work on Myanmar, Burma, are a little distraught because the war in the Ukraine and the Israeli-Hamas conflict has occluded much of attention of the newspapers and the scholarly community even to what is one of the most remarkable democratic federalist revolutions the world has ever seen. An entire civil society pretty much united almost to a person against the junta and its seizure of power. And things are looking rather more optimistic than they had before. But I wish uh, the world would pay closer attention to this unprecedented and quite decentralized, no external support to speak of, democratic federalist revolution. But today I'm going to talk about a book that I'm hope that will be published in the next few months called "In Praise of Floods," uh, to be a contrarian title, as is my wont. Um, and the subtitle now is "The Untamed River as a Source of Life." Um, what is perhaps distinctive about this book, compared to much of the literature on rivers, is that most books on rivers are concerned with H2O and Homo sapiens and who gets what and what the water is used for and the simple hydrological cycle. Um, this is a book that's concerned much more deeply with all of the riverine creatures, especially those who are non-human. And by that, I mean fish, aquatic plants, arthropods such as shrimp, photoplankton, bacteria, which is, of course, the basis of the food pyramid of the river itself, birds, insects, bivalves, reptiles, amphibians, and riverine mammals. Um, there is a chapter of the book devoted to uh, all of these non-humans and their complaints about the river. And the device that I have settled on for presenting this is the Irrawaddy dolphin, that is probably the most charismatic and endangered species along the Irrawaddy. And because it's a mammal, I thought that humans might listen to a mammal more than they would listen to uh, a fish or a bird. So the Irrawaddy dolphin introduces a whole series of other non-human riverine creatures who then tell their story about what has happened to their habitat, what has happened to their life cycle, what has happened to their history as a species. The Can I have the first slide, please? The next one, please, of course. This is a not ideal map of the Irrawaddy River. Like most rivers in Southeast Asia, it runs from north to south, and it takes its origin is in the Himalayan foothills, not quite so deeply into those Himalayan foothills as the Salween or Thanlwin, or the Mekong for that matter, or the yes, the Yangtze River, which also begins there. In any case, this is an extraordinarily navigable River all the way up to Bhamo, which is at least 3/4 of the way up the river. It is the superhighway of Burmese culture and integration, Burman culture and integration. That is to say, from one end to the other of this river, you will find the same language spoken, the same religion, Theravada Buddhism practice, the same culture in general, a whole series of comparable rituals. You have what are the spirits of the river gnats, who are believed to have an agency of their own in the river. These are all riverine creatures, if you like. And what's extraordinary is that the culture and language and religion is integrated all up and down the river. Whereas if you were to travel 20 miles into the hills on either side of the river, you would normally find yourself in places with different languages, different cultures than the Burman culture. So it is, if you like, the thing that knits together Burman culture and Burman history. I'd like to say a few things about rivers in general. Most important, rivers are alive. They usually teem with life. They move. They can be injured, damaged, and in some cases, you could say even murdered. Could I have the second slide after that, please? Yes. This is, unfortunately, we don't have one for the Irrawaddy, but this is the famous Howard Fisk map from the Army Corps of Engineers, actually, in the 1930s, of all of the meander belt, or part of the meander belt in the lower Mississippi. And you can see with the use of something like 13,000 boreholes, they were able to establish over time all of the separate channels that the river had jumped into. The white band that you see is the river, the main stem of the river in that area. And everything else is a channel, a back channel that was once a major channel of the river, and that is often used again if there is a particularly strong flood. It's also important to realize that rivers are geologically recent. That is to say, in the Irrawaddy case, the 8,000 years ago, there was no Irrawaddy River. What there was a bay of water or sea of water that went all the way up from what would be Rangoon, let's say today, all the way up to Bhamo. And it was a huge lake. And it was only later, after the water level went down, that the river appeared once again. So the point is that everything moves. If you widen the temporal lens widely enough, everything is in motion. The tectonic plates, for example, we're moving in the US, we're moving, I think, 3 inches closer to Europe every decade or so. Even things that we think of as being fixed in space are not, providing we open the temporal lens widely enough. So, for example, at the beginning of the last glacial maximum in Europe, oaks and beeches were all confined to tiny little refuges along the Mediterranean coast. Once the climate warmed, these oaks and beaches, along with all of the animals, insects, and soils associated with them, moved north over time. And if you had a time-elapse photograph, you could see exactly how they moved over time. So even trees, providing you open that temporal lens, are not fixed, but they are moving together with their assemblage of plants and parasites and so on. This movement is also daily and seasonal. The river is changing almost on a daily basis, and I want to give you just a brief example of that. Could I have the next one slide? Yes. So you see that bamboo pole. It is exactly the same kind of thing that would have been expressed in a rope in the Mississippi, and Mark Twain, of course, is a reference to how deep the water is. And so even in large ships that are or small ships going up and down the Irrawaddy, there are in low water periods of the season, they use these poles and call out the feet of clearance that there is under the hull of the ship, over time. And it's absolutely necessary for its safety. Can I have the next slide, please? Once in a while, however, they get stuck. You can see how shallow the water is here. And the three men here, what they're doing is they're embedding a pole in the mud as deeply as they possibly can, which will then be attached to a winch at the rear of the ship that will wiggle it back and forth in order to get it off of the sandbank where it had been embedded. So even in a large river like the Irrawaddy, at the period of low water, it is very common for ships to get stuck and moored, or for them not to move at all, or have to transship heavy loads to smaller ships that have less of a draft. The most important thing I want to emphasize about this river, and actually most rivers, is what is called the flood pulse. That is to say, it is the most important movement in the annual life of a river. The flood pulse is that part of the year during which the river overflows its channel and occupies its habitual floodplain. The pulse of high water may come from the monsoon in Southeast Asia, or for snow or glacier melt, or from seasonal rainfall. And it may be of different degrees of variability. But the flooding of the floodplain represents the lungs of a river in a literal sense. That is to say, the condition of its vitality and that of the creatures who depend upon it. Without the annual flooding of the floodplain, the channel, which we usually associate with the river at rest in paintings and photos, is comparatively dead, biotically speaking. So whenever we see a map, there's this line that indicates the path of the channel of a river, and it lulls us into the belief that the terrestrial world and aquatic world are sharply divided and permanently divided, so that everything outside that line is land and everything in it is the channel of the water. However, so much of a watershed is what I would call the in-between watershed. That is to say, those areas that are temporarily flooded, sometimes flooded for much of the year, for just very briefly, only in big floods. And so this in-between, sometimes dry, sometimes wet, sometimes inundated, sometimes just mud, is over time the most important habitat for many of the creatures who depend on the river for their life world. So the periodic flooding of the floodplain is the condition of existence of all species that inhabit the river or that dwell along the river. The fish, for example, and we know most about fish because they're an important economic product, get as much as 80% of their total annual nutrition from the huge pulse of flood at the flood stage because it spreads out over the floodplain. There, the fish who move to the floodplain are able to spawn and put on weight. They feed on the invertebrates, the decaying organic matter, and the microbes that are on the floodplain. There are huge migrations of fish to take advantage of this feeding frenzy. Some of them from saltwater, the so-called anadromous fish, and in many cases, fish that are endemic to the Irrawaddy River. There's a huge variation in the size of the river. The most extreme example of that, perhaps, is the Amazon, that is 40 times larger at flood stage than it is at rest. In the case of the Irrawaddy is roughly 9 times larger when it's at flood stage than it is when it is at rest. We have actually strong evidence that fish life in particular, because it's the subject of censuses, is much greater after a flood. That is so, for example, the Mississippi fish catch had declined 83% over 50 years, but the year after the famous 1993 massive flood, the fish catch was a new record. The studies of the Danube have also shown that the greater the extent of a flood in a given year, the greater the fish haul the year afterwards. It's not just fish that are moving, but a whole cavalcade of all those creatures who depend on the concentration of nutrition: waterfowl, riverine wet birds, riverine mammals, herbivores for the fresh grass sprouting after the flood recedes, and all the microparasites that feed on this cavalcade. As the flood recedes, much of this nutrition returns to the channel, where some of the larger fish, in the case of the Irrawaddy, the dolphins, and the channel cats, who cannot get to the floodplain, they benefit from the recession of the flood, bringing nutrition into the channel, main channel of the river, as well as immobile shellfish, clams, and bottom larvae, who also depend on the flood pulse to bring back nutrition to the central channel. What the flood does, in one sense, is to provide connectivity. It moves water over the landscape, creating a huge variety of habitats: backwaters, ponds, marsh environments, slow-moving warmer water, refuges from larger predators for smaller fish and animals, varied assemblages of food and habitat that favor different riverine species. This is, again, what I call the in-between landscape. The whole mechanism, of course, depends on the microbial richness of the floodplain that represents the base of the food pyramid for the entire life world of the river. Without the flood pulse, then the river is comparatively dead. I mean to emphasize non-human species here, but let me say a bit about what the flood pulse does for Homo sapiens. In a rather exaggerated way, one could say no floodplain, no civilization. Almost without exception, all archaic civilizations were found on floodplains, often near the estuary of a river. Bagan, the famous traditional capital from the 9th century on, was on an important and large floodplain. The floodplain is the only place where you can have a concentration of foodstuffs and people in a small circumference, which makes state making possible. Observe what the flood actually does. It drowns all the competing vegetation, aka weeds. It lays down a layer of nutritious silt that provides nutrients to the crops, often cereal grains. It provides, if the flood is well behaved, as it is in the Nile Valley, a perfectly harrowed field ready for sowing. No plowing is needed. Hence, the oldest form of agriculture, and the only form of agriculture could, in those days, compete with hunting and gathering for minimizing work for the biggest return of calories, was flood recession agriculture. That is, it depended on following the water back to the channel and following it by planting plants. I've been told that I must hurry up. How much time do I have left, by the way?
I don't know what they just sent you on the thing, but I would say we probably need to wrap up by about 10:45.
Oh, that's fine.
So, yeah.
That's fine. So,
Not
Two-
you.
there
You
are
don't
2
need to
points
wrap up by 10:45. We, the panel.
there are 2 points. There are 2 points I want to make about how the river has been radically changed by human intervention. And I'm going to use, even though it's disapproved of by the geologists, I'm going to use the term Anthropocene. And my argument is that from the beginning of agriculture in maybe 8th century BC up until the Industrial Revolution, I want to call that with respect to the river, I want to call that the thin Anthropocene. That is to say, small but cumulative impact of agriculture on the river itself. That is to say, what happens, of course, as the agricultural population expands in the floodplain, you can get an expansion of cropland, even though the population is relatively small, from say 4000 BC until beginning of the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution begins. There are huge ways in which there is a transformation of the ecology of the river before the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, all of the metallurgy requires a tremendous amount of firewood. The pottery kilns that characterize many of these civilizations are also very expensive in terms of the amount of charcoal or wood that is required, firewood itself, construction materials, and also gold mining in the rivers that had a tremendous impact over time, again, little by little by little, insidious in a way, in which the rivers were not the same rivers in, let's say, in 1800 that they had been in prehistoric times. What happens with the Industrial Revolution, of course, is that not only has the population expanded enormously, but the invention of dynamite, the creation of earth-moving machinery, and reinforced concrete, particularly important for dams and for dikes and levees, you have a massive transformation of the landscape. And um, it is a simplification of the river, and often it can be understood as a way of stopping the movement of a river, of limiting it, of redesigning it, of domesticating it. I like the word domestication here because domestication implies control over reproduction. And that's, in fact, what is involved in taming of the river. So you have a change of eras in which, in prehistoric times, until the 18th, 19th century, man adjusted to the river. And after that, man sculpts the river and re-engineers the river and adjusts the river to do exactly the things that Homo sapiens want it to do. That includes dikes and levees to stop floods, dredging for navigation, reservoirs for irrigation, the use on a large scale of the river channel to convey sewage and human wastes to the sea, industrial scale mining, particularly in Myanmar these days, the mining of gold and sand is enormously important. And finally, the ultimate amputation of a river that is typified by dams, in which you have a chain of lakes, each of which is supposed to produce hydroelectric power. What happens, of course, is that you have the loss of what I have called the in-between, and that means the habitat for many of the river creatures. You have more sediment and erosion because what you've done is replace, let's say, forests with annual crops that have very shallow roots and don't hold much water over time. So the level of erosion increases. It destroys spawning sites for many of the fish and birds. In the Irrawaddy River, something like 3/4 of the floodplain was destroyed in the last 50 years. And 3/5 of the species of fish have also disappeared. One suspects that a successful census of other creatures who are less important economically would yield many of the same results. The last thing I want to say is that stopping small floods has the ironic result of increasing the possibility of the severity of big floods. That is to say, it is true that all of these interventions, particularly dikes and levees, are an effort to reduce flooding. However, it means that the river cannot deposit its sediment on the floodplain, but deposits its sediment on the bed of the river. And in many cases, you get the river bed being almost higher than the surrounding floodplain. So that when they're, and so you raise the levees and dikes in order to prevent floods, and the river dumps more of its sediment on the riverbed. So it's a kind of like armaments race, with the result that there are fewer floods, but the floods that happen are likely to be far more catastrophic. Compare that, by the way, with the effort to prevent another form of natural disturbance, which would be forest fires. The effort to prevent all forest fires, as in Smokey the Bear, had the result over time to increase the combustible material in the forest enormously, so that you had fewer forest fires, but those you did have tended to be far more catastrophic. So the effort to stop all floods reduces floods, but makes the severity of the floods that do occur far more severe. The same is true, of course, for wildfires. There is an effort recently of river restoration, of moving with the river. Um, However, the needs of agriculturalists, of industrialists, and of production along the river, not to mention the people who've moved into the floodplain and built residences and businesses and towns and so on, uh, makes it unlikely that this restoration uh, will be successful in the short run. I would like to be more optimistic, but it seems to me we are, as in the end of the Mekong, the last days of the Mekong. Um, the Irrawaddy is probably more diverse than the Mekong because it has a smaller population and it industrialized rather late in the game. But it is also, if you like, a river in um, uh, severe condition. I want to show the slides very briefly. I'll run through them.
And if
Of
you, now that you've mentioned the Mekong, if you want to go through the slides here, and then we'll switch over to Brian, and then we'll continue the conversation in the question and answer time and the discussion time.
Yeah, sure.
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Does he want to go? Do you? Oh, yeah.
You see all the logs and the jars. By the last one, can I have the last slide again? The last slide is a terrible picture. And the reason it's here is because it's from the town of Katha along the northern Irrawaddy River, just below Bamal. And the house in the background is the house in which George Orwell lived for something like 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I turn it over to you. Do you want to speak here or here?
No, I can speak here.
Perfect.
And I'm glad that Professor Scott teed up the concept of floods and how we rely on them, as well as how living beings rely on them and how they shape the earth and our civilizations. Often when I show this kind of juxtaposed set of pictures, people are in shock. But these are perfectly normal photos here of places in the Mekong. One is of a low dry season section of the river along the Thai Lao border. The other is along the Tonle Sap Lake, where people live on stilted homes. When the flood pulse does come in underneath these homes, and then they can move out onto the lake in Cambodia to engage in fishing. And the reverse of these photos also exists too at different times of the year. That Thai Lao border photo is extremely flooded, and then the area underneath these homes that we're showing here is extremely dry. We'll go to the next slide. So we're going to take a journey down the Mekong with something that's provided through our agency as humans, data and technology to help understand what the impact we are delivering to rivers and flood pulses is. So we're going to look at some satellite-derived data that show how the flood pulse works, as well as data that is showing how humans are impacting this mighty river system of the Mekong. And importantly, as Southeast Asia scholars, the Mekong Basin itself is responsible for making up much of the map that we understand of Southeast Asia today, mainland Southeast Asia. So the Mekong coming out of China, right on the border with Southeast Asia, there's a floodplain there where the early Thai civilization or the Dai civilization formed and settled and engaged in flood retreat agriculture for rice production and established small kingdoms that gradually grew larger and began to migrate south and over a long period of a millennium made their way to Bangkok to establish the Thai civilization. Now that's a broad brushstroke of history, but there is a real connection to coming out of China utilizing the Mekong's abilities and forming civilization. Laos is very much in all of its territories, mostly in the Mekong Basin. Laos is kind of determined as where Thailand and Vietnam could not go farther, or where their territories began and ended. And it's very much defined, again, by the Mekong Basin and the very difficult terrain that is created by the tributaries, the many tributaries in Laos of the Mekong Basin, that also have formed Laos into a very disconnected political space. A political space that still has yet to unify into what we might agree on as a foreign nation state. We can argue over that policy, over that as well. But at the same time, it's that remoteness and the geography of the Mekong and Laos that has enabled it to be a zone of foreign competition, one in which China is very much active, and one that is getting the previous overlords of Laos, Thailand and Vietnam, kind of in a bit of a tussle over how China is now very active in the landlocked country of Laos. Obviously, then we move down into Cambodia, where the Mekong has formed the civilization of Cambodia. And the Cambodians remind us all the time of how the processes around the Great Tonle Sap Lake, which you're seeing expand and contract on the other map, which is satellite-derived, formed the ability for kingdoms to rise, for flood retreat agriculture, for the control of water, for massive irrigation works that could not only build a standing army, but giant temples, which we all visit today at Angkor. And then the movement of the Mekong is what has created the Mekong Delta, a patch of land in Vietnam, 12% of its land that holds about 20% of the population, and is responsible for many of the food products that you find here in the Bay Area, that you're going to be hard-pressed not to walk into a supermarket and not find food from the Mekong Delta, whether it's rice or fish. So it's the Mekong river system and that flood pulse that has pushed land out into the ocean over a short period of about 3,000 years that has enabled that part of Vietnam to be a food basket for the world and a critical income earner for the country of Vietnam. The flood pulse that we're watching is derived by my team through the Mekong Dam Monitor. We use satellite radar data from the European Space Agency to produce this in near real time. Every 2 weeks we watch the flood pulse. This is what you're seeing now is a kind of a quintessential example of what the flood pulse looks like, a normal flood pulse. And we can see many things on the changing dynamism in this map. One, between Cambodia and Vietnam, you see a very natural flooding situation in Cambodia, right? You see not just lines of a river, but you see a wide shape of a river that at times is 100 kilometers wide around the Tonle Sap Lake. Compare that with Vietnam, which is very much disconnected. There are lines in that flooded area, right? The flooding that you see happening in a very kind of predictive way in Cambodia doesn't necessarily translate down into Vietnam. So there's a difference there. And the difference is what humans are doing in Vietnam. Thank you. The other reasons why this is happening, and I have to point out that the expansion of the lake that you see in Cambodia, again, that which created the conditions for the Angkor Kingdom to rise, happens from this amazing reversal of the Mekong River. So that when the Mekong is very high during this flood pulse season, and it comes to Phnom Penh, it reverses the direction of the tributary flowing out of the Tonle Sap Lake, reversing it and pushing so much water back up into it, causing that lake to expand. Now, many of you are Southeast Asia scholars. You know this. This is not new to you. But that expansion is one of the miracles of nature on the planet. And it creates civilization, but it also produces Cambodia's protein intake. So 70% of the animal protein intake comes from that reversal of that expansion of that lake through the fish catch of that lake, making that lake the most productive single freshwater body of water for fisheries in the world, and making the Mekong Basin itself responsible for 20% of the world's freshwater fish catch. So the Mekong is the world's largest freshwater, has the world's largest freshwater fishery. That's all changing though. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples. I'm going to try to move fast so we have enough time for discussion. If we go to the next slide, focusing on Vietnam. Vietnam's kind of an early mover into the Anthropocene demonstration of impacts of how humans have ruined rivers. Vietnam saw the capabilities, actually the French did a long time ago, of how the flood pulse could be utilized and harnessed and controlled and built over a period of about 2 centuries, with the most happening in the last 50 years, 9,000 kilometers of canals with dikes along them to control that flood pulse. And in the 1980s, when the Vietnamese were emerging from conflict and establishing, their place in the world, they pinned the Mekong Delta as a food security guarantor for their country, and began to generate large amounts of industrial scale rice from the Mekong Delta, first for its own population, and then that turned into income for the rest of, through the export of rice to the rest of ASEAN and the rest of the world. And that could only be done through building these canals that you see here and controlling everywhere where water is going. So the white spots on this map are places that do not flood. So you're turning a flooded expanse into one that is, again, harnessed and controlled. The white spots are areas where irrigation can happen, and it often does happen 3 times a year for three crops of rice. Now, this control of the Delta has gotten Vietnam kind of in a bind, where these areas that are entirely no longer accessed by floods can no longer produce the 3 crops of rice that they used to. So in a period of about 3 decades, 4 decades, that land has been entirely ruined. And the Vietnamese Communist Party now has, at the highest level, made a commitment to restoring floods. So they're knocking down their levees, they're knocking down the dikes, and trying to find nature-based solutions to bring different types of crops, higher value crops, back into the Delta. Next slide. This is, however, the control of the Delta has caused many problems. So the lack of flooding is bringing in more salinity during the wet season, particularly, creating difficulty for agricultural production in the Mekong Delta. Sea level rise, obviously another Anthropocene result, is bringing more and more salinity deeper into the Delta each year and each day with the daily effects of tides. With the lack of fresh water, particularly in these controlled areas, the Vietnamese are bringing more and more water from the underground, from underground aquifers, and that's causing the land there to sink. So there are parts of the Mekong Delta that are sinking at 3 centimeters per year, 4 centimeters per year. And if you think about sea level rise, this sinking is a magnitude higher than what sea level rise is doing. So those 2 forces are working together to really destroy this part of Vietnam that's critically important to its economy and to the people who live there. With sea level rise, the predictions, there are different predictions on how sea level rise will affect the Delta. But by the end of most of our lifetimes, much of the Delta is going to be underwater, particularly during storm surge events. And the Vietnamese are struggling how to deal with this. Floods would have made the Delta stronger. Floods would have allowed the Delta to push farther out into the sea. But instead, the over-engineering has created many challenges for the 20 million people that live in the Delta. And now there is a mass exodus of people leaving the Delta. I'm going to move fast here, though. We're going to kind of zoom out and look at the larger basin. Next slide. And to focus on some of the dry season, really awesome things that happen during the flood pulse process. At this time of year, birds lay their eggs along the exposed banks of the Mekong River during the dry season. Their migration patterns and their life cycles are tied to that rise and fall of the river. Now, hydropower releases are causing many of these now endangered bird species, their nests to be threatened. because hydropower releases are happening during the dry season when the price of electricity is high due to high demand, due to high temperatures. The flood retreat agriculture that Professor Scott mentioned earlier, this is an image from Luang Prabang, the middle image, which, you know, it produces the food identity of the people of the Mekong. It creates cheap and easy access for farming for tens of millions of people who engage in this type of farming. This is also going away as more and more hydropower releases are raising the level of the river and flattening that flood pulse. And in Cambodia, there are flooded forests where the roots of these tree systems are exposed during the dry season. And the up and down, where during the flood season, those roots are not exposed, but the blooming, the blossoming of those trees do happen during the dry season, help to create the habitats of things like the world's largest freshwater fish. So you all might remember the giant stingray that was found in June of 2021, a 650-pound stingray, 13 meters across. Its habitat is determined by that flood pulse going up and down year to year. Next slide. This is how the flood pulse happens over time, and it's data provided by the Cambodian government, started with the French. It's something that we have to demonstrate that this Mekong beats its heart every year. So here are this is 80 years of representation of that beating heart, or the flood pulse. We'll go to the next animation. And we can see in the recent era, the peaks of the floods are coming down. But it's kind of hard to also see that the valleys are coming up. So to really get a feel for what's changing, next slide, we can look at the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake and see how the variability of the ability of the lake to expand is changing from year to year. So this is the last 6 years. The peak expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake, something is causing different levels of expansion. Whereas in the past, it typically would reach its full expansion width, particularly 2019, when it really only expanded about half as much as it typically would. And when it doesn't expand like this, the fish production hurts as well. The diets of the people of Cambodia hurt as well. Something is causing this variability, and it's linked to us. It's linked to both dam impacts as well as climate change impacts. And now we're able to know what those impacts are. And so the next slide focuses on the impacts of dams. A lot of you might be familiar with following the development of mainstream Mekong dams. There are now 12 in China. There are 2 completed in Laos. Cambodia has canceled 2 of its planned Mekong mainstream dams, or at least sticks to its promise to keep them canceled. But next animation, there are actually more than 700 dams throughout the entirety of the Mekong Basin now. So this is a new map that our team has produced. We find reservoirs, we find the dam walls, and we put the dots on the map to show that Thailand has the most. And they're not hydropower dams, they're water supply dams for flood, urban water use or flood control. China is not the second. Vietnam is also an upstream country. So in the Central Highlands, where much of the US war was fought in Vietnam, there are now 138 dams that all have their impact on that flood pulse to a degree. Just moving really quickly, I want to show you what the impacts of these dams are and how it's impacting the flood pulse. Next slide. So a great place to look and start is at Chiang Saen, Thailand, in the Golden Triangle. This is the area of the Mekong Basin that's the closest to China's dams. So here are 4 decades of the pulse going up and down very reliably. Next slide. So that's the dead river that Professor Scott was talking about. So the pulse, the peaks are coming down, the valleys are coming up, and there's a lot of variability. And what this is doing is it's ruining the fisheries and killing the river system in this part of the Mekong. Next slide. And locals there know it. They're out and protesting. I was actually just, one of the great things about the Anthropocene is that we can talk to people very easily. I had a inquiry about river embankments come in. What's the cost of a kilometer of river embankments in Chiang Rai province along the Mekong, Brian? The media question. I'm like, I don't know that answer. But within 5 minutes, I had that answer because I asked the people in this picture what it costs, because they're worried about how those river embankments are changing the natural ecology of the river around this area, which the ecology is changing very quickly. This is an area where activists are very much anti-dam. They're fighting for their local identity. It's a place where the Mekong giant catfish had been caught for decades. But now you only see statues of the Mekong giant catfish because they're no longer being caught. Again, moving quickly, next slide. We've found that the most of the change is caused by these two huge dams in China. Our team monitors weekly volumes of those dams. This is important because the PRC doesn't provide the data to the downstream. And before we were providing this data, locals could only speculate as to why the changes were happening. These two dams are as large as Lake Mead and Lake Powell in the United States, and they have profound impacts, not just at Chiang-Saen, Thailand, but they translate all the way downstream to Cambodia and to Vietnam. Next slide. But recently, the largest dam hasn't been filling. You know, it brings the question as to, are these a good bet? Are they good investments for, say, China to produce a lot of hydropower to fuel its industrial processes on its east coast? Next slide. So just again, to show you what the impacts are, this graph here is a good example of that. So during the wet season of 2020, the top of those bars is higher than the blue line. The blue line is the long-term pulse, an average mean pulse. The river would have flowed above the pulse during 2020. But the dam restrictions, as water was being stored in these dams, brought that level lower than normal. The most in the month of August to 34% lower than a normal peak. Next animation. But recently, if the height of the bars is below the long-term mean, that's a climate effect, right? So the river would have flowed much lower than normal under natural conditions. So something's happening with the climate. We're finding that the wet seasons naturally are less wet, and also they're peaking at different times. And this is causing a shift in the ecological processes and has a translation into the human uses of the river as well. Next slide. During the dry season dam releases raise the level of the river and create a lot of erratic patterns. So there are times when dam releases have doubled the river level at Chiang-Saen, Thailand. Next, March 2022, triple the river level at Chiang-Saen, Thailand. And the rivers need to be as low as they can during the dry season. You know, the goal is not just to have the highest peak possible to drive a fishery production, but also the low matters as well. Next slide. Just to move downstream and to show what these impacts are in Cambodia. Next slide. The fishery of Cambodia's Tonle Sap Lake is also taking a hit. During a string of very dry, wet seasons from 2019 to 2021, there were anecdotes that said the fish catch in the Tonle Sap Lake was reduced by 80%. Cambodia does not have the capability to conduct a good fish stock estimate of its lake. This is something where development partners like the United States could help. But again, we can only rely on anecdotal evidence. But we're finding that by looking at combinations of dams and how they bring down the pulse, that certain combinations of dams in Laos can be as impactful to, say, Cambodia as those in China, depending on the time of year. And the impacts are less of a magnitude than, say, at Chiang-Saen, Thailand, because you've got all these rivers coming into the Mekong downstream in Cambodia. But still, a 12% reduction of flow is significant, right? 17% reduction of flow is significant. And when I give this talk to young people in Southeast Asia, they're like, what's 10%? And I said, well, hey, if I cut your salary by 10%, you're not going to be happy with me, right? And it kind of gets through to them. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. We'll just skip these. Also to show that dam releases in Cambodia have the ability in certain months to double flow. So that would be dam releases above Cambodia. China's dams tend to do the most in terms of impacts, but the groupings of dams in parts of Laos and Vietnam also have a significant impact. And importantly, we're able to measure these now. When you can measure this, you can show pathways to change. And now that the data is known, the information is in the hands of those who can put it to use. It's really up to them to think of better ways to operate the river for various purposes. And we push for, at the Simpson Center, we push for a trade-off, a way to maximize the amount of hydropower production and fisheries at the same time. And there are other ways to build benefits into these assessments, depending on what's important. And if you think about Professor Scott's talk, he's arguing for all the beings in the river, and it's that all these beings have created a river system on which that makes the Mekong a mighty system. I'm going to end here, but just to kind of do what Professor Scott did, we go to the next slide. This is the impact of high river levels in Cambodia during the dry season, that those exposed root systems on the trees that I showed earlier, they're all dying out. Cambodia is now committed to preserving this flooded forest in northern Cambodia, but it can't be done without better transboundary water cooperation. It can't be done without better upstream dam operations in Laos and Cambodia. Next slide, and this will be the last one. And now there's what's happening today with the Funan Teco Canal. Cambodia is committed to building a new canal from Phnom Penh to the Gulf of Thailand. And this canal has gotten Vietnam very much concerned about how the canal will impact both its production of agriculture and uses of water in the delta downstream, but also there are defense and security concerns about this canal. And next slide will be where we'll stop. And I have more analysis on this, which shows some of the environmental impacts of the canal, but we'll save that perhaps for discussion. But this is the pathway of the canal. And it seems like a good idea for Cambodia because it gives a river access from its capital to the ocean, allowing Cambodia to bypass the need for sending ships down the Mekong River to industrial ports in Vietnam. And rely on Vietnam for riverboat trade. But it's going to have profound impacts on the floodplain, which moves through this part of southern Cambodia and into Vietnam. And importantly, and again, I'm moving quickly, you can Google this and read more about it. There are worries that Cambodia's new kind of best friend in the region, the PRC, could use the canal for Coast Guard or brown water Navy purposes to conduct joint river patrols or security operations and access parts of the Mekong that previously could not be accessed given the natural situation of the river flowing from Cambodia into Vietnam. Much more to say about this, but I'll stop so we can have a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. We have about 10 minutes or so for some discussion, and I had some questions. I sent a long list to them rather late, so I'm not sure if they've even had time to look at them, so it's dealer's choice. And I'm going to go with, in a time in academia where the agency of non-human actors are being more readily recognized and studied, what is your thoughts on the push for recognition of the human impacts on environmental systems? Is this a legacy of our human-centric approach to the world? And how would our understanding of the climate crisis be different if we approach it from a place that centers non-human actors, including living and non-living? So whoever wants to go first.
Well, you're certainly correct that there's been an explosion of literature that tries to understand the ways in which non-human creatures experience and sense the world and adapt to it. And so this, I think the monotheistic religions uh, uh, created, if you like, Homo sapiens as the only creatures with agency, and the rest of them were creatures that were manipulated, controlled, or evaded, if you like, by Homo sapiens. And the literature about mycorrhizal connections between trees, between the sort of signaling that takes place in terms of the invasion of parasites, um, and John, what is it? The An Immense World is a kind of good compendium of an effort to understand the non-human sense of intelligence and adaptation and agency. And I don't think this would happen if we thought we were still in certain control of the material world. The fact is that the material world has become dangerous for us. Sea level rise, global warming, all right, and so on, in a way that we realize that we have deeply damaged many of the other species on which ultimately our own life depends. But they deserve a kind of understanding that surpasses just our interest in preserving those that we know are vital for human thriving. Um, and so what's interesting to me is that it's a form of environmentalism in which there is more concern for the life and thriving of other species besides just humans. And it's not all about how can we control the material world, which we've lost control of.
Just some quick comments on that. Like we point, going back to the nesting birds along the dry river banks during the dry season. Sometimes during our work on our weekly reporting in the Mekong Dam Monitor, we follow a nest, and our messaging says, well, because that part of the river is most impacted by, say, China's upstream dams, we say this is the wrong time to be releasing a lot of water because that nest is going to die, and then the critics jump on us, say, well, why do you care so much about these birds, right? Or and often it's the Chinese state media, oh, the Stimson Center is talking about the birds again, right? So you see a struggle to recognize the biodiversity of the downstream versus the trade-off, which is hydropower production and industrialization. With that giant stingray that I showed, those fish typically would be rushed to market, chopped up, sold in restaurants right away, or sold to local peoples. But the capture and release of these large species now is being valued in Cambodia as a result of a lot of promotion that comes from catching one of these big fish and having 100 million people see it online. But they're doing it because they get the market value of the fish from the promotional events. So there's a reward and incentive process that's built into the recognition of the importance of these species. It's having an effect, and I think it's great. But the recognition isn't happening because of the intrinsic value of biodiversity of the Mekong, rather than because someone is personally benefiting from it.
Yeah. I'm thinking also of assisted migration. So assisted migration is this idea that a good example is the redwood trees, that humans kind of dabble in figuring out as the climate changes, where these redwood trees might be growing in the future. And so you've got, up where I live, no redwood trees up in the Olympic Peninsula, but you've got the Jamestown Slalom people who have planted a bunch of redwood seedlings in the hopes that in the coming decades that will be the new territory, so they're giving them a head start. And so we often dabble in some of these processes that we don't really understand. For example, for a while there, the English were very obsessed with redwood trees, so they took a bunch of seedlings again back to England, and now they are growing so large that they're crowding out all of the native species. And so we have to like kind of consider that perhaps there are limits to our knowledge and limits to what we understand about these processes and cycles that are happening within the natural world. And so kind of taking a step back maybe and I guess letting nature kind of figure things out.
Well, one point on that, and again, it's quick, is that there was this string of very dry, wet seasons from 2019 to 2021 where the region was saying this is climate change, right? That it's happening because of climate change. And certainly that was a climate effect, but is it a result of climate change? I think we need more study. And one of the political results that came out of this string of low wet seasons, of dry wet seasons, was that the downstream countries, Laos in particular, said we need more reservoirs because the flood pulse is important to the downstream. Cambodia jumped on this bandwagon too because they recognized the flood pulse. So we need more storage reservoirs just for water use. We need big ones, so that when the peak is not happening, we can flush more water into the river system to try and engineer the peak. And I said, you're going to do more dams and you're going to disconnect an already connected system just to try and re-engineer it. Let's wait to see, because as Professor Scott said, some of the more severe floods could be coming in the future as a result of what we've done, and that option to build more reservoirs could be a maladaptation practice that doesn't pay off in the future.
So another important aspect of this conversation is the balance between risk and vulnerability. In the case of water, people love being around water. They build houses near it. They build urban developments and high-rises on barrier islands. They create capital cities, Jakarta, in floodplains and estuaries because of the cost-benefit analysis, and they find that their enjoyment of water outweighs the risk of living near it. This is just one example, though, which kind of complicates our idea of risk and vulnerability because generally we think of that as lower socioeconomic status, but in this case, rich people really like water too. So how does water and hydrological systems challenge or support our findings regarding risk and vulnerability with regards to the climate crisis? And this can be in Southeast Asia, but also more broadly.
I guess I wanted to make at least the rudiments of, I think, a very powerful argument against the actual configuration of cost-benefit analysis as it's used with respect to dams. I mean, we know enough now to know that partly because it's the prerequisite of funding to show that you have a certain level of return, that by and large, almost all dams, they underestimate the cost of building them, and they overestimate the benefits that will flow from them, either because, let's say, the sediment backs up very quickly, or because of a whole series of other things which relate to what you said, which is knowing what we don't know. And so the larger the intervention we make that is irreversible, the more likely that we will make serious and large mistakes. It's the other thing about cost benefit analysis is that it is a convention that cost benefit analysis, that you must show that the return on a dam, let's say, is greater than, in the future, the interest rate if you put just the money in a bank and collected the interest from it. What that does, actually, and it means that any benefits that come after 5 or 6 years are likely to be minuscule in terms of the calculus that cost-benefit analysis uses at the World Bank. And as a result of that, it is a decision about future generations that's made as an accounting convention that needs to be justified and is in fact not justified, I think, on the basis of our empirical evidence of the past. I think it's a McNulty book on dams has a lot of these statistics about cost-benefit analysis. And of course, cost-benefit analysis is costs and benefits to Homo sapiens, not to uneconomic species of fish or microbes and so on that are in the water. So it's anthropocentric, and it also discriminates, if you like, against future benefits by virtue of its accounting rule.
Do you want to add anything on that one?
Just to kind of close on this new canal in Cambodia, it was notified by the Cambodian government to the Mekong River Commission as a canal to be used for commercial functions. And there were some extra benefits noted with it to boost ecotourism and sustainable livelihoods along the canal's course, but no mention of irrigation. Since the notification, Cambodia's leadership has talked about transportation benefits, commerce, and lots of irrigation. And this is something that's getting the Vietnamese really concerned, because the only way meaningful irrigation can be done via the canal is from the Mekong River and from the Mekong dry season river flow. And that would be done at the great expense to the downstream in Vietnam. So that is just to note that there are competing uses of water for water-related infrastructure, and a kind of a lack of acknowledgement of the benefits that water provides in a transboundary context when, say, water is diverted for upstream irrigation use. The final point is we haven't talked about the Mekong River Commission, that there is a governmental organization, intergovernmental organization set up to try and diffuse these types of conflicts that are happening over water in Southeast Asia. But on this particular instance of the Funan Teco Canal, the Mekong River Commission has not been able to get involved in an appropriate way, and is seeking inroads to do so. Why that is, it's a longer story. Happy to talk about that at coffee break. Thanks.
Speaking of coffee break, thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you to Professor Scott for joining us from Connecticut. And thank you for joining us here today for this discussion on the Anthropocene in Southeast Asia. And I think we are now going to move into that promised coffee break. So thank you very much.